The differences between the United States East and West Coast. That's right, in today's video, we're going to be finding that out from my first impressions as a Scottish man travelling the United States of America. That's coming right up. Hey, my name is Sean. I'm a Scottish vlogger. And on this channel, I will be telling the story of how I fell in love with the United States of America. From its beautiful landscapes, its rich food and culture, and, of course, its wonderful people. Hit the subscribe button for weekly videos from me. Thank you for watching. Hello folks, how are you doing? Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Sean and I'm a Scottish guy who has travelled extensively throughout the United States of America over the last few years, and I'm here on this channel to share my experiences. Great to see you here, thanks for joining in. If you're new to my channel, please don't forget to hit subscribe, hit the thumbs up, share this video with your friends and family and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to be launching a brand new series here on this channel all about the kind of cultural differences, language differences and specifics of different regions of the United States of America, because it is such a vast place with many different unique identities and unique ways of being around the country, whether you're on the East or West Coast. And that's coming right up in today's video in particular, but I will be covering lots of other topics. Not just East and West, I'll be covering the South, I'll be covering like kind of Midwest, the whole range of stuff and everywhere I've been. Because if you don't know, over the last couple of years, I've been traveling the States quite a lot. Last year, for example, I traveled all the way from Seattle down to Los Angeles and quite a lot of different places in between. And then on the East Coast, I've been all the way from New York down to Key West and everywhere in between. Many of those videos you will have seen on my channel already, and I will be referencing some of those videos as we go along, but many of those videos you haven't yet seen. So another thing you don't know that I'm announcing right now today, in June I'll be launching a brand new road trip vlog series on Sundays, which is going to kind of start from Nashville and then head slowly down the East Coast. That is a summer series and I'm very excited to be sharing those videos, and it's coming right up. But I'm very excited to do these other kind of cultural difference type of videos because I think they're interesting and fun. And so from now on, we're going to have 2 videos per week on this channel. Every Sunday from June is going to be a travel vlog, and then midweek on Wednesdays we're going to do these kind of cultural identity type of videos because I just think they're interesting. I think they do add value to the conversation. And some of you guys say to me on the regular when I do these videos on my channel that you kind of appreciate the outside perspective. It gives you a different view of America that you might not have had because, you know, as someone who's lived there your whole life, you might have kind of internal biases and different perspectives on the country based on the fact that you've been brought up there and lived there your whole life. But maybe me as an outsider, someone who's not kind of lived there my whole life, comes in with a bit of a fresh idea. I don't know, let me know your thoughts down below. And before we get properly into it, the last bit of an announcement is I've launched a brand new newsletter and website. You'll find the links to them down below. The newsletter is seantakesamerica.substack.com. Very much appreciate if you join up there and you'll get exclusive news and all the rest of it every week for your inbox. And then seantakesamerica.com is my brand new website where I take you through all the kind of travel stuff that I've learned on my travels through the United States of America. Again, the links are down below. Please check them out. Add them to your favorites on your web browser or whatever people do these days. That'd be much appreciated. So let's get into it. Today's video is very particularly, specifically, about the differences I notice as a Scottish man travelling in America between the East and West Coast. And I have to say, this is a bit of a disclaimer, you can take a lot of what I say with a pinch of salt because, like, I have spent quite a lot of time travelling in America, probably more than most people from Europe, for example, but not extensive, and I actually need to come back and spend more time in a lot of these places to really kind of understand them. These are kind of first impressions. Some of them, therefore, kind of go along the lines of stereotypes. And I also realise, you know, this video's covering East v West Coast, but there's so much more to America that I need to cover in these videos. For example, like I said, the Midwest and the South. They'll be covered in different videos, okay? This is going to be a long-term series we're going to be doing every week on this channel. So yeah, 2 impressive parts of the world, the East and West Coast of the United States of America. I'd say if you add them both up together, you're probably talking about one of the largest economic regions together and separately in the whole world. On the East Coast, you've got all that financial power, and on the West Coast, agriculture. There's just so much going on. Hollywood as well, obviously. The distance between the East and West is so vast, like 2,800 miles or something. Very, very long distance. You could traverse Europe in that type of mileage. And so for me, the first thing I would say is it blows my mind at how far away they are from each other. You literally take like an overnight flight to get from one to the other, which is crazy. And then you have to traverse a time zone as well. A 42-hour car journey to get from one to the other. That's if you don't stop. And then you've got all the differences between weather and all the rest of it. Well, we'll get into that. The first thing I want to talk about is the differences between coffee culture. This is a kind of a weird one because I know that some of the big chains are basically present in both big time, but I definitely noticed on the West Coast, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where I started my journey on the West Coast, there was this very much pride in Starbucks. And the Starbucks culture, it was everywhere. And that kind of Starbucks culture went all the way from the Pacific Northwest and all the way down through California as well. Starbucks, obviously, you get it on the East Coast and everywhere else in the world, even here in Edinburgh where I live. But it was very much a kind of pride, a matter of pride for the people of the Pacific Northwest in particular. On the East Coast, it was slightly different. Of course, like I said, you've got Starbucks there, but there's this definite lots more other varieties of stuff where people kind of show more interest. I would say something like Dunkin' Donuts on the East Coast is quite common and popular, and say more so, and there's lots of other kind of international coffee brands on the East Coast as well, which probably just do just as good or better than Starbucks. Starbucks is obviously an iconic American brand, but it is a West Coast thing. Definitely, I noticed more on an East Coast, it was a bit more varied. Coffee, let's get that out of the way first thing, right? It's important, we all need a good coffee. Two, this is a bit of a little funny quirk that I noticed, and actually a lot of my viewers who are on my YouTube channel mentioned this to me as well that I would see. People say out west when referring to the West Coast, and they've referred to the East Coast as back east. Out west versus back east. I do find that language difference quite interesting, peculiar maybe even. Reference to a long-term historical thing where people and how the Europeans, English-speaking Europeans, how they settled throughout the United States, right? They started on the East Coast and they made their way west. So they would say out west, and then when they made it there, they would talk about being back east, because that's where they came from. Now let's talk about outdoors, because I think this is important and it's something I really enjoy. The great outdoors and the differences between the East and West Coast. And this is a massive generalization because both coasts have things that I'm going to mention in equal measure, right? But I definitely found that on the East Coast, people are more kind of fair weather outdoor goers. Now, of course, not that far from places like New York, you do get some really massive mountains, and I did spend times on the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, for example. But I find that people on the East Coast tend to stick to a lot of kind of well-trodden paths. For example, easy accessible beaches. And I found that all the way down the East Coast, people are much more into their nice little family day trips, which is cool. Whereas on the West Coast, I think people are a little bit more extreme, probably just for the fact that the landscape is very different and probably a lot more harsh on the West Coast. Much higher mountains and ski ranges and all the rest of it, and proper mountainous forest walks. For example, I was so blown away by the giant redwoods in California, and getting lost in those woods and going for big hikes and stuff is quite an intimidating thing. In the East Coast, traveling up and down the East Coast, I never really saw anything that was that intimidating. But on the West Coast, definitely feel intimidated by some of the places. Proper adventure, hardcore adventure outdoor stuff. But then as we get into my next point, the kind of danger element and excitement flips on its head, because on the weather front, I think on the East Coast it's far worse than it is on the West Coast, and much more perilous in some cases. I travelled throughout the United States last year in various different times of the year, and I definitely noticed a heightened sense of security around the weather on the East Coast. So for example, people were often worried quite a lot, for example, by hurricanes, which come to the East Coast, Coast Board? I don't know what the right term for that is. Up the East Coast, from Florida all the way up to kind of like Boston, for example, you can get hurricanes through the hurricane season towards late summer, and they are no joke. People rightfully have to be worried and prepared for them every single year. People, for example, in Florida, every year have to have an escape plan. That for me is kind of crazy. Now, on the West Coast, slightly different. People don't have those concerns necessarily, although on that side, they have to be a bit more worried by things like earthquakes, more kind of natural disaster type things. Whereas they also have really terrifying forest fires on the West Coast as well. I was out there with a lovely couple who live quite close to San Francisco, and forest fires are a major concern for them. So I think it's kind of interesting, you have these extremes of weather on both sides. And by the way, here in the UK we don't really have those kind of extreme weather events, extreme things that could be massively life-threatening. And I think that's kind of one big difference necessarily between where I live in Europe compared to America. As in America you get these extreme weather events which are life-threatening and you literally have to pack your bags and leave home. Forest fires, earthquakes, hurricanes, they're all terrifying, right? And you need to be prepared for them. East and West Coast both have their challenges, but they're very different from each other. Overall, the weather seems more benign on the West Coast, but that's not to say they don't get their problems as well. Like I said, droughts and then massive rains. East Coast hurricanes. It is, for me, it's really fascinating. I love natural phenomenon. I'm really fascinated by it. I always think in an alternative life, I might have been a meteorologist or a storm chaser. That would be cool. But I'm not a storm chaser, I'm a fair weather storm chaser. I watch it online. Again, the next one's a bit of a generalisation. I definitely found on the East Coast, people are a lot more kind of busy and they have lots of events to attend all the time. Like there's always things going on that people need to be at and doing. Whereas in the West Coast, people have a lot more of a relaxed, chilled out way of life. They're not always so concerned by being on time for things, for example. Massive generalisation alert. East Coast, like massive kind of cultural events and theatres and stuff like that. On the West Coast, obviously have Hollywood and all the rest of it, but a lot more kind of laid back and farmers markets and ranches and stuff. Those two type of things I found very different as well. And then if I move on to the next thing, kind of fashion. If we talk about fashion quickly, East Coast is very, very kind of modern fashion and lots of kind of hipsters, you might say, in some of the big cities, definitely, but people who are pushing the boundaries in fashion. I think that's an interesting point in general because, again, here in Europe, we push boundaries with fashion and we do different things that we feel that other places in the world don't often do. But certainly in East Coast America, people push boundaries with fashion, especially in some of the bigger cities, where I felt in the West Coast, people were a little bit more reserved and a bit more summery in general, right? They always wear, shorts and t-shirts, surf shorts and surf t-shirts, quite common. Surf wear in general, or skate wear, you might call it. Floral, lots of floral stuff, floral t-shirts and floral dresses and all the rest of it. I think, definitely I would say East Coast a bit more modern, a bit more pushing boundaries in terms of fashion. West Coast a bit more casual, relaxed, and cool. Personality, I want to touch briefly on personality because there is a difference in East and West Coast. And there's a couple of things here that I think are quite important. East Coast people are definitely kind of busier and no nonsense about their approach to things. Sometimes it feels like they're impatient when they're speaking to you. And they don't seem to put up with BS at all. Where I feel like in the West Coast there is definitely a more relaxed vibe to people. Slightly more like kind of easygoing, take it as you go. But that's very surface level because actually I think it's unfair. Because I had some really, 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 really awesome, warm experiences with people on both coasts. New York even, for example, people were so helpful, went out of their way to help me through my day. Put themselves at inconvenience to help me, and I found that really surprising because that's not what people say about people from New York. So like New York and lots of the big East Coast cities, people are busy, they've got things to do, they've got places to be, but they will go out their way to help you. My most recent trip, for example, to Philadelphia as well, I found that. People definitely have things to do, people to see, places to be, but they'll stop and help you. West Coast people are definitely more chilled, relaxed and laid back. You could say that as an overall thing. But moving on to the next thing, and the way people speak to you, like I mentioned, on the East Coast, people are direct. They'll say what they want without any kind of concern really for what other people think of that. And whether it's a positive or negative thing, they will tell you what they think. So you know where you stand with people on the East Coast. Whereas in the West Coast, I found people a bit more guarded. They hide their feelings and thoughts and don't necessarily share them, at least till they get to know you. So sometimes on the West Coast with people, you don't necessarily know where you stand. Different styles, and I'm not saying one's bad or good or whatever. It's just different, right? And as they say, variety is the spice of life. Alright, accents. I think this is an interesting one because I found, and maybe I'm wrong with this, maybe I just wasn't picking it up, right? But definitely on the East Coast, there isn't an East Coast accent, right? Because everywhere from New York to Philadelphia to Washington DC to Charleston in South Carolina to Savannah in Georgia and Florida, like these are all places which are, relatively close to each other on the same coast, and yet they speak so differently from state to state. I found that quite fascinating. They speak so differently in all these states. There's no single East Coast accent. The East Coast accents might as well be different countries. Whereas in the West Coast, like I said, I went all the way from Seattle down to Los Angeles. I found the accent more difficult to distinguish. It was more kind of all the same, really. I didn't necessarily pick up on those differences as strongly as you do on the East Coast. I would love to know your thoughts on that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I just wasn't picking it up. But it's certainly something I noticed when I was out there. The accents on the East Coast are very varied from each other. There is no East Coast accent. Well, in the West Coast, there kind of is a West Coast accent. But, and this takes me on to my last point, and I think it's probably important to point out, like I said, on accents, there's so many varieties on the East Coast, and then food cultures as well, lots of differences as well. And that should be pointed out, right? But I'm making out like as the West Coast is kind of one homogenous region. And of course, there's a lot yet to see for me on the West Coast. And I didn't make it as far down as like San Diego, for example. But I think the West Coast, there is variety there, right? There was a massive difference, for example, between my experience in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon and Washington to more south into California, for example, I did notice big distinctions in the people in those type of places, and the landscape and the weather and the food and all the rest of it. So it's not as if I'm saying like it's all the same on the West Coast. I think it's important for me to make this point that I did notice differences in those parts of the world. I just think on the East Coast, in terms of the people, the way they are, and the landscapes, and certainly the food culture, certainly when you talk about the kind of northern part of the East Coast, and then when you reach into southern American territory with the Carolinas and Georgia and that, there's a massive distinction. So anyway guys, those are my first impressions and my first kind of reaction to the differences between people, things and other stuff that I noticed between the East and West Coast. There's many more that I could have went into in this video. These are just kind of my first thoughts that came to my head as I was going along. Like I said, I went on lots of road trips of the East and West Coast and lots of other places in between last year, and I'm excited to be sharing more of that on my channel as we go forward. And like I said, don't forget, from June onwards, there's going to be a vlog, a travel vlog from the United States on my channel on Sundays, and on Wednesdays we're going to be doing these kind of cultural interaction type videos. I'm looking forward to getting into them. But that was it for today's video. I would love to know your thoughts about everything down in the comments. Please leave them down below. I'll leave some links to some playlists, some videos you might want to check out if you've not seen them already. And don't forget to sign up to my newsletter, Sean Takes America, and check out my new blog website. Alright, that's it. More videos coming on your way really soon on this channel. I really appreciate all your support. It's great to talk to you as always. Until the next adventure, I hope you have a good night, morning, evening, afternoon, or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are in the world. Take care.